Someone hurt you. Maybe it was something they said. Maybe it was something they didn't say. Maybe it was a look, a tone, a moment where you realized something you believed about this person or this relationship was not what you thought. And instead of speaking, instead of defending yourself, you went quiet. Not because you had nothing to say. You had everything to say. The words were there, the feelings were there, but something else was there too. Something stronger. A wall that came down between you and the very thing you needed to express. And you disappeared into yourself. You became unreachable. You answered questions with nods or one-word responses. You were physically present and emotionally somewhere entirely else. And the person who hurt you probably didn't understand. They thought you were being cold. They thought you were punishing them. They thought the silence was a weapon. It wasn't. If you go quiet when you're hurt, not as a strategy, not as manipulation, not as a choice you consciously make, but as something that happens to you before you've decided anything, this is not a character flaw. This is not emotional immaturity. This is one of the most documented and least understood responses in all of human psychology. And what science has found about why it happens will change the way you see yourself completely. Let's start at the beginning. When something hurts you, not physically but emotionally, your brain doesn't process it the way it processes ordinary experience. It processes it the way it processes threat. And it runs through a specific sequence that most people are never taught and almost no one understands. Dr. Stephen Porges, a neuroscientist at Indiana University, spent decades developing what he called polyvagal theory, a framework for understanding how the nervous system responds to safety and danger. What he found overturned the simple fight or flight model that most people are familiar with. Your nervous system, Porges discovered, has not two states, but three. The first is what he called the ventral vagal state, the state of safety and connection. When you're in this state, your heart rate is steady, your breathing is relaxed, you can think clearly, speak openly, engage with other people. You have access to your full self. This is the state where real conversation happens, where repair happens, where you can say what you need to say. The second state is the sympathetic state, the familiar fight or flight response. You feel this as anxiety, anger, urgency. Your heart rate rises. Your muscles prepare for action. You might argue, you might cry, you might reach out, you might storm off. But the energy is still moving. And the third state, the one almost nobody talks about, is what Porges called dorsal vagal shutdown. This is the body's last resort. It activates not when the threat seems manageable, not when fighting or fleeing seems possible, but when the nervous system decides, below the level of conscious thought, that the emotional situation is simply too much to process through normal means. And in this state, everything goes quiet. The body pulls back. Social engagement becomes impossible. Speech becomes difficult or impossible. You become, from the outside, what looks like stone. But you are not stone. Inside the shutdown, there is often an enormous amount happening, feelings that have no exit, thoughts that spin without resolution. Dr. Lira De La Rosa describes it precisely. What looks like coldness or punishment from the outside is a nervous system saying, "This feels like too much right now." The person isn't choosing to shut down. Their biology is choosing it for them. Now, here's the part that gets deeply personal. Not everyone goes into shutdown when they're hurt. The answer is your history. John Bowlby, the British psychologist who developed attachment theory, spent decades documenting how the earliest relationships of our lives, the ones we had before we had language, before we had any capacity to analyze or choose, create a template for how we respond to emotional danger in adulthood. When a child's early environment is one where expressing pain is safe, where tears are met with comfort, where needs are met with warmth, where vulnerability is received rather than punished, the nervous system learns something foundational. Reaching out when hurt leads to relief. Expressing pain is survivable. Connection is possible even in difficult moments. Silence is safer than speaking. Disappearing is safer than being seen in pain. And this lesson, learned before it could ever be questioned, before the child had the capacity to evaluate whether it was true, becomes embedded not in the conscious mind, but in the body itself, in the nervous system, in the automatic response that fires before any decision is made. A 2025 study published in Scientific Reports found that avoidant attachment, the pattern that forms when caregivers are consistently emotionally unavailable, leads directly to emotional suppression and a specific reluctance to seek support when hurt. For people with this attachment history, silence is not indifference. It is a learned self-protection so deeply ingrained, it no longer feels like a choice. And a 2025 paper published in Mental Health Science found that both avoidant and anxious attachment styles, two different early histories, both produce speech suppression in response to emotional threat, though through different internal mechanisms. One shuts down because speaking never helped. The other shuts down because the internal emotional experience is too overwhelming to translate into words. But here's the part nobody talks about, and this is where it gets uncomfortably personal. Going quiet when hurt is not just a learned response. It's also, often, a response to a very specific fear that most people who experience it are not consciously aware of. Research published in the Journal of Research and Personality found that fear of being negatively evaluated, the fear not just of being hurt, but of being seen hurting, of being witnessed in your pain and found lacking, goes directly hand in hand with emotional suppression. People who go quiet when hurt have often learned through experience that displaying their pain makes them more vulnerable, not less. That being seen in their hurt has, in the past, led not to comfort, but to further distance, not to repair, but to judgment. So they protect themselves the only way available, by becoming invisible. They stay quiet not because they don't want to be known. They stay quiet because being known has felt, too many times, like a risk they couldn't afford to take. Psychologist Judith Jordan, founder of relational cultural theory, describes what happens next with devastating clarity. Disconnection, she writes, is often experienced not as power, but as pain. The person who has gone quiet is not winning. They are not in control. They are suffering in a particular kind of isolation. The isolation of being in the room with someone and being completely unreachable. And the irony that makes this so painful is this. The people who go quiet when hurt are often the ones who feel the most, not the least. The silence is not the absence of feeling. It is the overwhelming presence of it. Feeling so much, so fast, so intensely, that the system that was supposed to translate feeling into language simply shuts down. Neuroscientist Dan Siegel at UCLA calls this flooding, when the emotional brain, the amygdala and the limbic system, is overwhelmed by incoming emotional information. It can quite literally hijack the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for language, for reasoning, for articulating experience. The words don't just feel hard to find, they become neurologically inaccessible. The thinking brain goes offline. What's left is pure experience with no exit. And on the outside, this looks like withdrawal, like coldness, like punishment, when on the inside it is something much more like drowning. A Frontiers in Psychology study published in 2026, analyzing 15 studies in over 2,400 participants, found that silent episodes in close relationships predicted emotional exhaustion and relational disengagement, not because the silence was intended to harm, but because it created a self-perpetuating cycle. The person who is hurt goes quiet. The other person, confused and destabilized by the silence, pushes for a response or withdraws themselves. The pushing feels threatening to the already overwhelmed nervous system, producing deeper shutdown. The cycle repeats. Nobody gets what they need. Both people suffer. And here's the thing that almost no one says aloud. The person who goes quiet often wants desperately to explain. They want to say, I went quiet because it hurt, not because I don't care, not because I'm trying to hurt you back, because something in me doesn't know how to hold this and speak at the same time, Because somewhere along the way, I learned that speaking up when I was hurting made things worse, not better. And that lesson is so old and so deep that I can't override it just by deciding to. I need something different, something I may not even know how to ask for yet. Because the shutdown is not forever. This is the part the research consistently points to, but that gets lost in conversations about emotional withdrawal. Dorsal vagal shutdown is not a permanent state. It is a protective state. A state the nervous system enters when it doesn't feel safe and exits when safety is restored. Deb Dana, a clinician and researcher who significantly expanded on Porges' work, developed what she calls the polyvagal ladder, a framework for understanding how the nervous system moves through its 3 states. And what the framework shows with clinical and scientific clarity is that the movement out of shutdown happens through one primary pathway: safety. Not logic, not explanation, not demands for communication or ultimatums about behavior. Safety. Consistent, experienced, felt safety. The kind that doesn't come from being told that everything is fine, but from having enough repeated experiences of reaching toward someone and being met with warmth rather than distance. The nervous system that learned to go quiet did so because it learned that speaking up wasn't safe. The same nervous system can unlearn it, but it cannot unlearn it through willpower. It cannot unlearn it through deciding to be different. It unlearns it the same way it learned it in the first place, through experience. Slow, patient, accumulated experience that says, this time was different. This person stayed. This moment of vulnerability didn't make things worse. For the person who goes quiet, the path forward is not about forcing yourself to speak in the moments when your system has already shut down. Those are the worst moments to try. When the prefrontal cortex is offline, when the dorsal vagal state has activated, when the words literally cannot be found, pushing yourself to speak is like trying to run on a broken leg. The biology simply isn't there. The path forward is in the moments before and after, in learning to recognize, with curiosity rather than shame, what happens in your body in the seconds before you go quiet. In building, slowly, the internal resources that make the shutdown less total, less consuming, less long. In finding the people and the environments where the nervous system begins to learn that it is safe enough to stay open. And for the people who love someone who goes quiet, who feel confused by the silence, who take it personally, who push against it because the not knowing feels unbearable, what research shows is clear. Pushing for a response in the moment of shutdown almost always deepens it. What helps is offering something the nervous system can feel as safe. A quiet presence, the absence of demand. A simple signal that you are not going anywhere. Not because you agree with the silence, but because you understand that it is not about you. It is about something much older than you. Something that was written before you were ever part of the story. You are not broken because you go quiet when you're hurt. You are someone whose nervous system learned, in conditions that no longer